let's get going. Okay, so this is lecture 5 of Philo of Alexandria, Philosopher, Mystic, Defender of His People by Rabbi Lawrence Troster. It is October 29th. Okay, so we're continuing with our discussion of his work on the giants.
No, this is 6, sorry.
This is 6, lecture 6. Okay. On the giants, if you'll remember, is an interpretation of just a few verses in Genesis chapter 6, which comes just at the end, before the Noah story really begins. And it's the beginning of chapter 6 of Genesis, especially verse 1. And he has interpreted this allegorically. The story itself is a fragment of a mythological epic of fallen divine beings who come down from heaven and mate with human women and produce giants. There's evidence of this myth elsewhere in the Tanakh, when the inhabitants of the land of Canaan are called Anakim and Nephilim by the spies. Nephilim suggested fallen ones. The point is, Philo has interpreted this completely as a philosophical allegory. And so we're in the middle of his short treatise on this, which is we're on page 153, and I think what he's trying to show that the word in Greek for translated here as demon, which is really daimon, and it doesn't mean demon in the sense that we are, but rather that they are incorporeal beings who live in the air. He has said that just as the earth has earthly creatures, the water has watery creatures, fire has fiery creatures, since certain kinds of serpents or amphibians were considered fiery creatures, so the air has creatures, and they're called daimons. And he says that they're basically similar to souls and angels. He in effect, he's saying that there's no such thing as a wicked angel. He's reinterpreted a verse from the book of Psalms to show that that this doesn't refer to angels. For him, there are no demons the way we understand the word demon, and an angel as a messenger of God really cannot be evil. Another point is that he associates the notion of daughters with the flesh and therefore with inferior matter as opposed to the spirit. So the fact that Noah only has sons at the end of chapter 5 is significant for him, and the fact that daughters are born to the men on the earth is an increase in this idea of the notion of people who are committed to pleasure rather than, and we would say excess pleasure, hedonism, rather than to philosophical and rational thought and activity.
The divine beings of the Nephilim?
The divine, well, the point is his version of things is that this is an allegory. We're not taking it literally. I mean, the literal story is, there were these celestial beings who come to earth and mate with earthly women and produce giants as their children. It's very similar to all kinds of myths in the ancient world, but he sees this as a philosophical allegory of the fall of people who have lost their ability or are giving themselves up to pleasure and hedonism, as opposed to studying philosophy or the Torah or that sort of thing. And so he's going to continue to discuss. That's his understanding. So if we look at number 19, which is on the right-hand column on page 153. Do you guys have you didn't bring your book? Yeah? No? Okay, so listen along. Suzanne, you want to start reading in all such matters?
And in all such matters, it is impossible for the Spirit of God to remain,
and to pass all its time, as the lawgiver himself shows. For, says Moses, the Lord said, my spirit shall not remain among men forever, because they are flesh.
Okay, and what he's quoting here is verse 20 of chapter 6, when God is speaking to Moses and telling him to build an ark, as to why, and he says, why he wants to destroy the earth.
It's also in verse 3.
Yeah, sorry, that's really that. Sorry, that's the reference. Is verse 3. Our translation says, "My breath shall not abide," but he is understanding it from the Greek to mean soul, spirit, right? Ruach can have both the sense of breath, wind, or spirit, meaning the creative.
Page 11.
No, he does.
Sorry.
Yeah, he does have the Tanakh.
Page 11.
Ruach being the creative force within God, represented by wind, right? Because wind moves things, right? So read on.
For at times it does remain, but it does not remain forever and ever among the greater part of us. For who is so destitute of reason, or so lifeless, as never, either voluntarily or involuntarily, to conceive a notion of the all-good God? For very often, even over the most polluted and accursed beings, there hovers a sudden appearance of the good, but they are unable to take firm hold of it and to keep it among them.
So notice he says that the divine spirit is that which moves us towards doing the good, right? And it's impossible for it to be with us at all times, but likewise he believes it's impossible for it to never be even with people who are polluted or hedonists or fleshy or whatever.
Right.
Okay, go on.
For almost immediately it quits its former place and departs, rejecting those inhabitants who come over to it and who live in defiance of law and justice, to whom it never would have come if it had not been for the sake of convicting those who choose what is disgraceful instead of what is good.
In other words, it quickly leaves those who are not willing to do this. We're on 153, Ellie.
153.
Yeah, 153. Read on.
But the Spirit of God is spoken of in one manner as being air flowing upon the earth, bringing a third element in addition to water, in reference to which Moses says in his account of the creation of the world, the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters.
And of course, that's Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. And so he understands that that spirit, pneuma in Greek, which is the translation of ruach, can mean wind, but it's not just wind. And for him, air is one of the basic elements of the universe. Go on.
Since the air, as it is very light, is raised and borne aloft, having water, as it were, for its foundation. And in another manner, unalloyed knowledge is said to be so, which every wise man naturally partakes of.
Keep reading.
And Moses shows us this when speaking of the Creator and Maker of the holy work of the creation in these words. And God summoned Bezalel and filled him with his Holy Spirit and with wisdom and understanding and knowledge to be able to devise every work. So that what the Spirit of God is very definitely described in these words.
And he's making a very a correct connection between the Ruach Elohim, the wind/Spirit of God that's in the Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, to the idea that Bezalel, who is the builder of the tabernacle, is filled with the Ruach Elohim. The only other person in the book of Genesis who is said to be filled with the Ruach Elohim, aside from Bezalel, is Joseph, by the way. But the point is that the creative force of God, which hovers over the face of the water and is in the form of wind, is the same creative force that God is going to put into Bezalel to build the tabernacle. And notice, it will fill him with wisdom and understanding, knowledge. For Philo and other philosophically minded persons, this is the divine knowledge one achieves in philosophy and the true understanding of Scripture. And in fact, he's actually hooked onto something here, because when you take a look, the building of the tabernacle is parallel to the building of creation. And when is Bezalel appointed to be the builder of the tabernacle? There are six parts to God's commands to 7 parts to God's commands to Moses to build the tabernacle. Those match the 7 days of creation. They don't actually match it in their content, but the fact is there are, starting in chapter 24 of Exodus, you can divide up the commands to build the tabernacle into 7 sections. The last section, in fact, is the commandment to observe the Shabbat. The 6th one is the appointment of Bezalel, which matches the creation of humanity on the 6th day. So there is a direct parallel, because we know this biblically because it's the same school, the priestly school that wrote Genesis 1 and the tabernacle sections. They see the building of the tabernacle as the finishing of creation, and the tabernacle is, in miniature, the microcosm of the entire cosmos. Now, Philo is deeply read enough in the Bible, even in Greek, that he's picking this up, that there's a parallel between Bezalel and the beginning of creation, that somehow Bezalel, by getting the Ruach Elohim, is receiving something of the creative energy of God himself. The same energy that causes the creation of the universe. Yeah.
Doesn't Solomon also get his wisdom imparted?
Yes, but it's not referred to as Ruach Elohim. It is referred to as wisdom, Chokhmah, but and there are other places where the exact phrase doesn't appear, but the same kind of thing is implied. There is a sense that anyone who is a prophet has somewhat of the Ruach Elohim, somewhat of God's Ruach. But the fact that the exact same phrase is used in Genesis 1 and with Bezalel is highly significant. Highly significant. And the idea that this Ruach Elohim imparts you with knowledge and understanding and wisdom is also really significant. And that's what Philo's picking up on here. And he goes on in the same manner. Irma, do you want to pick it up, number 24?
Such also is the spirit of Moses, which came upon the 70 elders for the sake of making them differ from and be superior to the rest of the Israelites, who could not possibly be elders in real truth unless they had partaken of that all-wise spirit. For it is said, I will take of my spirit which is upon thee, and I will pour it upon the 70 elders. But think not...
Okay, so what is he referring to here? He's referring to Numbers 11, when God appoints, Moses is getting some help. So he has 70 elders from the tribes, and they go up on Mount Sinai, and they have a vision of God. Actually, no, that's earlier on. This is a very similar thing where some of the Ruach which has been given to Moses, which allows him to be the prophet and the leader, is now going to be imparted to the 70 elders. The thing about them seeing God actually occurs in Exodus, but it's a very similar idea that somehow the leadership is going to be spread out, and in order to do that, some of the Ruach which Moses gets now has to be imparted to others. All right?
But think not that thus this taking away could be by means of cutting off or separation. But it is here, as is the case in an operation effected by fire, which can light 10,000 torches without itself being diminished the least atom, or ceasing to remain as it was before. Something like this also is the nature of knowledge. For though it has made all its pupils, and all who have become acquainted with it, learned, still it is in no degree diminished itself, but very often it even becomes improved, just as, they say, that fountains sometimes are by being drained dry, for it is said that they sometimes become sweeter by such a process.
This is interesting. What is he trying to do here? Because it says in the text that part of the Ruach that has been given to Moses will now be given to the 70 elders. But what does he want to say about this?
It doesn't diminish Moses.
It doesn't diminish Moses. And he's got a really great analogy that you have a fire and multiple fires can be lit from it, and the original fire doesn't get diminished by it. And then he talks about the nature of teaching, right? I mean, he also talks about sometimes if you drain a fountain dry, when the water comes back, it's sweeter. I have no idea what he's talking about here, but maybe it's because, you clean the thing. I don't know. The point is, but look what he's saying. He's saying something about teaching, isn't it? That teaching doesn't diminish the teacher.
Well, the teacher has a well, a volume.
Yes.
And he's passing that on, but he's not he's not diminishing his own source, his own well.
By giving it away, the teacher doesn't become ignorant.
It becomes sweeter when it is diminished because it becomes more rare.
But I think his point is it doesn't become diminished.
Well, I mean, as it says, when the fountain
right.
That means there's less of it.
But then it regenerates itself.
Well, I think he's saying it doesn't diminish the teacher, but it doesn't diminish knowledge.
Yes.
Knowledge can go on and on and on and be spread, but it doesn't lose anything in the process. I mean, it's still knowledge.
Exactly. And
if you wanted to go way out, isn't there something in the scientific world that you can't destroy matter?
Right. That everything. It just gets transferred and turned into something else. Yes. Exactly.
The word atom is that? I mean, this is before the concept of molecules, isn't it?
Yes.
So,
well, actually, in the Greek world, there is an atomic theory that there are fundamental particles, not in any way like our atoms, but the word atom actually comes from this Greek idea. There are some that in effect say that all matter is made up of fundamental particles that just keep rearranging themselves. And basically, pretty much that was kind of what people believed, because so first you have the fundamental, what we would call elements. We've got the periodic table. Them they believed essentially there was fire, air, earth, and water in the terrestrial world. Once you get beyond the moon, then you're in a whole other story. But the point is, there are 4 fundamental elements, and everything in the earth is just a constant mixture and movement of these elements. Some went so far as to say that these elements are made up of fundamental particles of those elements called atoms. And they just keep moving around and changing. So that we would call it recycling, right? When you die, the matter in your body, your soul leaves the body, goes to wherever it's going to go, but the matter in your body then breaks apart and then gets into other things. And again, this is just this constant recycling of matter going on the earth, because that's the nature of matter, to be changeable, as opposed to spirit, which is unchangeable. So our modern atomic theory actually came from the Greek idea, but of course completely revamped and so on and so forth. And I don't know whether Philo has that particular theory in front of him. I mean, he knew about the 4 elements, but whether he actually believed in the old atomic theory, I'm not sure. Maybe I'll find out. Okay, why don't you read on a little more?
For continual association with others, engendering diligence and practice, gradually works out entire perfection. If then the individual spirit of Moses, or of any other creature, was about to be distributed to so great a multitude of pupils, then, if it were divided into such a number of small portions, it would be diminished. But now, the spirit which is upon him is the wise, the divine, the indivisible, the undistributable, the good spirit, the spirit which is everywhere diffused, so as to fill the universe, which, while it benefits others, is not injured by having a participation in it given to another. And if added to something else, either as to its understanding or its knowledge, or its wisdom.
So for him there, the divine Ruach fills the entire universe and is never diminished, because that's, in effect, it's God. In effect, it's God. And therefore, a person's individual Ruach might be diminished, but never the divine Ruach, the divine spirit. As I said, in Greek, it's pneuma. Psuche. Sometimes pneuma. Pneuma also is used as well. That's where we get our word pneumatic from,
Oh.
Okay? Harvey, you want to pick it up on 28? What?
I just
Pathologist, the pathologist.
I see.
Pneumoconiosis. Inhaling.
Okay.
Dust particles.
On which account it is possible that the Spirit of God may remain in the soul, but that it should remain forever is impossible, as we have said. And why need we wonder, since there is no other thing whatever, the possession of which is stable and lasting, and pardon me, but mortal affairs are continually.
You okay?
Yes, I can see it. But mortal affairs are continually wavering in the scale and inclining first to one side and then to the other, and liable of different times and different changes. And the greatest cause of our ignorance is the flesh, and our inseparable connection with the flesh. And thus Moses represents God as admiring,
As admitting.
Where he says that because they are flesh, the Spirit of God cannot abide.
So again, he's making this idea that the Spirit of God cannot forever abide in an earthly being. And this is how he is interpreting the text in Genesis. And what, in effect, which is different than what you might say the plain meaning of the biblical text, which is when you look at the length of the years of people in chapter 5, you see they living hundreds and hundreds of years, right? Methuselah being the one who lived 969 years. That's the longest, but they're hundreds and hundreds of years. And what God is saying is, because of this intermixing with the divine and the human, which is improper, I'm going to limit human life to 120 years maximum. So this is where you first begin to see something that, the change in humanity from these kind of mythological ancestors who lived these incredible lengthy lives to something that is more likened to normalcy. And this is the reason why it happened. There is to use a Christian term, there's a fall, right? There's a fall of humanity. And it's not the garden. It's this incident at the beginning of chapter 6. Yes, Harvey?
Is it the origin of the Yiddishism?
Yes, because Moses lives 120 years. In other words, nobody in the Bible after this lives, except, Noah gets to live out his life. But the point is, nobody lives more than 120 years. And so you find, and then even only the great people live 120, close to that. Most people don't even get close to that.
How do they interpret the number of years Noah is ascribed to be given? 950, I think?
No, because he's the last, right? He's the last one to live that length of years, 950 years. In other words, because he's from the pre-flood generation. But from that point on, nobody's going to live longer than 120 years, and and they're not guaranteed to get that far necessarily.
Maybe that's a good thing.
Yeah, it's a way of explaining, why don't people live 900 years anymore? And this is one of the answers. In other words, if the original people lived all these long years according to these stories, what happened? right?
Well, isn't it argued that they were counting differently also?
Even if they were counting differently, there's a theory that a biblical year is in fact 6 months. I mean, even then, you cut Noah and it's still over 400 years. The point is that puts most people 120 years being 60 years in ours, which sounds a lot more reasonable back then. But the fact is, there's a radical change in the length of human lives. And what he is doing is he's changing the meaning of that to refer to the idea that nobody can have the continuous, intimate connection with the divine spirit, which hopefully we'll get to some texts on some of his mystical texts where he talks about having this connection personally, but we've even seen in some of his personal autobiographical fragments that he speaks about it as being something that doesn't happen continuously. It happens for little bits and pieces here and there. It's a flash. It's not something that's a continual state of being. Yeah.
Just have a digression.
Sure.
I saw on the news, a 105-year-old man from Britain was honored by the Czechoslovakian government for saving 350 Jewish children during the war, and he did it by lying and cheating and forging, and someone said that to him, and he said, "Ooh, I haven't heard it described that way, but whatever it took."
Yeah, he was not the only one to do that kind of thing. But that was part of what
made me think of. He said he's 105.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
It.
exactly. And he, may he live to be 120. But yeah, he was one of those rare individuals that did whatever they could to save people, before and during the war. A cousin of my wife's in England was very active in that work, and was a very modest man, so he was rarely public. He didn't talk to his own grandchildren about it, and or his, I don't know, he didn't get married. His nieces and grandnieces and nephews. He was honored for it, but he was very, very modest about it. But he was involved with negotiating. He was negotiating with Eichmann on the day of Kristallnacht in Vienna.
This man said he did. He said, "I didn't hide it, but I didn't talk about it."
Yeah, well, this guy was doing stuff on behalf of various Jewish refugee organizations before the war, and did all kinds of other stuff during the war. His name was Julius Leighton, and in fact, there was in Florida, in one place, there's a Holocaust museum, and they actually once did a whole thing about him. But he's not as well known. But I met him before he came over and visited once before he died, and amazing man. He just talked very, modestly about it. But what happened was his branch of the family had moved from Germany to England in around 1900. But they kept a connection with the family in Germany, and it was in fact his brother, Ralph, who was the one directly responsible for getting my wife's family out of Germany in 1939. But Julius was actively involved in this same kind of work.
Was the negotiation giving money?
I don't know. He never said, but he told something very chilling, that he was with Eichmann, and Eichmann said, "Stay off the streets tonight," because they knew what was coming. Right. So there's actually there's a book which he's mentioned in prominently in his work. But anyway, people. It's one of those things where people tried to see length of days as evidence of some kind of moral good. In those days, and for them that was a sign of some positive thing in the person's life that they were able to achieve.
Well, elders in any society have always been given
exactly
respect and position.
Exactly, because so few of them survived, right? I mean, when you think about it, the mortality rate. First of all, once you get past child mortality, even then, accidents, violence. Disease, all kinds of things can strike somebody. So someone who lasted a long time was well respected, but also when most societies were literate, they were the depository of the community's knowledge. and therefore passed it on. All right, read on.
Let's see, Moses represents, and thus Moses represents God as admitting where he...
We're in the middle of number 29 on page 154.
Because they are flesh, the Spirit of God cannot abide in them. And yet marriage and the bearing of children and the furnishing of necessary things and rigorousness... And in gloriousness conjoined. Why do you react in English? With a want of money and business, both private and public, and the countless number of other things cause wisdom to waste away, before it begins to flourish vigorously.
Meaning most people are so caught up in the day-to-day rearing of children and making money and doing everything else, they don't have time to cultivate wisdom. And by the way, somebody once asked, did Philo ever get married? We have no evidence that he ever did. So he may have, in fact, chosen not to get married, and he came from an extremely wealthy family, so he didn't have to work. But we do know that he was forced to be involved in public life because of the prominence of his family, and this is something which he understood as a necessity, but not something that he liked. He was one of these people who wanted to go off and basically read a book. You know?
When he refers to wisdom, in that sense, does he mean the study of Torah?
He means Torah, philosophy, what we would call science. In other words, we looked at an earlier selection where he talks about learning language. In other words, the Greek curriculum of what you studied, adding on to that the study of the Hebrew Bible with him in Greek translation, that for him is Chochmah. And for him, philosophy, like it was for Maimonides, is essentially an esoteric study for the few who have the time and the ability, the mental ability to delve into its depths, because it's not an easy thing to do. And it isn't. Read on, but there is nothing.
But there is nothing which is so great a hindrance to its growth as the fleshy nature. For that, as it were, the principal and most solid foundation of folly and ignorance. It is laid down firmly, and then each of the forenamed evils is built up.
That's why he never got married.
Yeah, exactly. In other words, again, we would find him a little ascetic, right? He believed that the body is an hindrance to the soul, and because he's a Platonist, and he sees a sharp division between the body and the soul is trapped in the body. All right, and that's where we obviously have a lot of it. Anyway, he goes on pretty much in the same way with all of this. Well, you know what? Let's read a little further. Marianne, you want to pick it up at 31?
Sure.
For those souls.
For those souls who are devoid of flesh and of the body, remaining undisturbed in the theater of the universe, occupied in seeing and hearing divine things, of which an insatiable desire has seized them, enjoy a pleasure to which no one offers any interruption. But those which bear the heavy burden of the flesh, being weighed down and oppressed by it, are unable to look upwards to the revolutions of the heaven, but being dragged downwards, have their necks forcibly pressed to the ground like so many quadrupeds.
So he is comparing humans who, because of their bodies, are forced to be like animals, as opposed to non-corporeal beings, these daimons, these angels, who live without any concern of this, and therefore have the ability to, not to worry about the body. Read on, in reference to which.
In reference to which fact, the lawgiver, having determined to put an end to all illegal and illegitimate associations and unions, begins his denunciations in the following manner. Quote, man shall not come near to anyone who is akin to his own flesh, to uncover his nakedness. I am the Lord.
Now, this is the beginning of the laws in Leviticus about incest. So now he is going to interpret this philosophically. I mean, it doesn't mean he doesn't accept the literal prohibitions, but he's seeing behind it something more. Read on.
How could anyone more forcibly exhort man to despise the flesh and what is akin to the flesh than in this way? And indeed, he does not only exhort us to abandon such things, but he shows positively that he who is really a man will never come of his own accord to those pleasures which are dear to and connected with the body, but will always be meditating to alienate himself from them entirely. For the saying, man, man, not once but twice, is a sign that what is here meant is not the man composed of body and soul, but him only who is possessed of virtue.
And if we were to quickly look at Leviticus 18, we would see that in the Hebrew, in fact, it what is it? 18:6. He in effect says ish, man. All right, which the translation basically says, none of you shall come near anyone of his own flesh.
Because
Meaning
it's intensification if you
yes.
if you repeat it, right?
Right, it means kind of everyone. In the Hebrew, it really means everyone. Like no one shall, none of you. That's the point. But he's taking the repetition to be something deeper. Read on. For such a one.
For such an one is really a true man, whom someone of the ancient philosophers, having lighted a lantern at midday, went in search of, and told those who asked him that he was seeking a man. And as for the prohibition against every man coming near to anyone who is akin to his own flesh, this is induced by necessary reasons. For there are some things which we should admit, such, for instance, as those useful things, by the employment of which we may be able to live in freedom from disease and in good health. And there are other things which should be rejected, by which, when the appetites become inflamed, they burn up all goodness in one vast conflagration.
So who's he referring to when he says the philosopher who lighted a lantern at midday and went in search of a man? Diogenes. He's referring to the figure of the philosopher Diogenes, who's walking around in the daytime with a lantern searching for a true man. All right, a well-known, an honest man, a real man. I don't know, we would maybe a mensch, who knows? But the point is, it's a well-known story in the ancient world. Okay, so essentially he goes on in this regard. In fact, continuing his interpretation of that verse in Leviticus. Skip to number 38 on page 155, but Marion, keep going for a little longer.
155.
Yeah, number 38, but as many as our masters.
But as many as our masters of themselves show that all brilliant prosperity, which is an object of so much contention, is in subordination to the mind, which is the principal part of them, receiving it when it comes so as to make a good use of it, but not pursuing it if it keeps aloof, as being able to be happy even without it. That's a little too convoluted.
Mm-hmm.
But he who pursues it eagerly and follows upon its track fills philosophy with base opinions, on which account he is said to uncover its nakedness. For how can there be any concealment or ignorance of the reproaches to which those men are justly exposed, who profess indeed to be wise men, but who make a traffic of wisdom and bargain for the sale of it, as they say men do in the market, who put up their wares for sale, sometimes for a slight gain, sometimes for sweet and caressing speeches, and sometimes for insecure hopes, founded on no sure ground, and sometimes even for promises which are in no respect better than dreams.
What is he talking about here?
economical things, markets, trade.
No, he's talking about
people who sell their teaching, or even just for praise, not necessarily for money.
Yeah, he's talking about, and this, by the way, is something that you see happens in other earlier Greek texts from Greek philosophy, that there are those that are, like the sophists who teach people how to do clever arguments to win for material gain or some kind of gain, people who peddle philosophy in the marketplace. He's attacking teachers who are out for profit.
Sounds like politics today.
Yes. What he then does in 40 is, in the verse in Leviticus, it ends with the phrase, I am the Lord, right? In Leviticus 18, at the end this happens a lot in Leviticus, that the end of a law will say, I am the Lord, as a way of sort of doing a justification for the law. So then he goes into a long exegesis on this phrase, I am the Lord, to, in effect, say, I am the Lord because I'm perfectible, perfect, incorruptible, and so on and so forth. So he is saying, in effect, that people should become godlike. And he goes on and he does a couple of other similar kinds of exegesis of various texts of this kind, about the tabernacle and the high priest. In other words, he's using this initial discussion of Genesis to go off onto this whole thing about the nature of the spirit and its relationship to the flesh. He finally gets back to the giants on page 156, number 50. He 57. He talks. He basically says now he's going to discuss it. So, Sam, you want to pick it up at number 58? And there were giants on the earth in those days, which is based on chapter 6 of Genesis, verse 4. So, would you start reading that one, number 58?
On the earth in those days. Perhaps someone may here think that the lawgiver is speaking enigmatically and alluding to the fables handed down by the poets about giants, though he is a man as far removed as possible from any invention of fables. Who is he referring to?
Moses.
Oh, okay. And one who thinks fit only to walk in the paths of truth itself.
One of the interesting things is, he says the translation, and I should check the Septuagint. He says there were giants. In fact, it doesn't say that in verse 4. In the Hebrew, it says the Nephilim were on the earth, and he is in effect maybe working from the Septuagint, translating Nephilim, meaning giants, which is the interpretation of what Nephilim are. So he's not actually even quoting a literal translation. He's already quoting a translation which seems to have moved it further away from, because the word Nephilim is in our translation, they use it as a proper name. They don't translate it, and we know that it probably comes from the root for the fallen ones. Read on.
59.
Yeah, in consequence.
In consequence of which principle he has banished from the Constitution,
meaning the Torah,
which he has established, those celebrated and beautiful arts of statuary and painting, because they, falsely imitating the nature of the truth, contrive deceits and snares in order, through the medium of the eyes, to beguile the souls, which are liable to be easily won over.
So he's interpreting the prohibition of statues and images, because statues and images cannot reveal the truth. They deceive the eyes. And so he sees this is a fable, a parable, which reveals truth much more than a painting or a picture could. Read on. Therefore
he utters no fable, he meaning Moses?
Yeah.
Therefore he utters no fable whatever respecting the giants, but he wishes to set this fact before your eyes, that some men are born of the earth, and some are born of heaven, and some are born of God. Those are born of the earth.
No, so he's making three categories of people. Men of the earth, some are born of heaven, and some are born of God. Go on. Those that are born of the earth.
Those that are born of the earth, who are hunters after the pleasures of the body, devoting themselves to the enjoyment and fruition of them, and be eager to provide themselves with all things that tend to each of them, such as multiplying, as
Right.
provided as.
And so he understands the giants were on the earth to refer to those men who only devote themselves to bodily pleasure. In other words, he's completely understanding the term not literally, but philosophically, because remember, he's been making this whole point about the spirit and the flesh, and the spirit is superior to the flesh, and you got to be careful. If you devote yourself to the flesh, it will corrupt you, and you won't be able to study philosophy. So for him, the Nephilim, or as he translates, the giants, are men who devote themselves to bodily pleasure. Read on, Sam. Those that are again are born of heaven.
Those again are born of heaven, who are men of skill and science, and devoted to learning. For the heavenly portion of us is our mind, and the mind of every one of those persons who are born of heaven studies the encyclical branches of education and every other art of every description, sharpening and exercising and practicing itself and rendering itself acute in all those matters which are the objects of intellect.
So we would say that the men who are born of heaven are those who have studied knowledge, science, craft, all these kinds of things that are of the mind, which he says is our connection to heaven. So now the last one, of course, are the men who are born of God. Read on, Sam. Last, yeah.
Those who are born of God are priests and prophets, who have not thought fit to mix themselves up in the constitutions of this world and to become cosmopolites.
Cosmopolites.
Thank you. Who having raised themselves above all the objects of the mere outward senses, have departed and fixed their views on the world which is perceptible only by the intellect, and have settled there, being inscribed in the state of incorruptible, incorporeal ideas.
Meaning philosophers, prophets, philosophers, priests who are completely devoted to divine service. These are the people who've raised themselves up above any earthly concern whatsoever. And what he means by cosmopolites are people who live in the general society. For him, that's what it means. Cosmopolitas means man of the
It sounds like city or urban.
Well, it means for him it means the laws of nature.
Man of the earth.
Yeah, it means like citizen of the world. That the basic laws of following the basic laws of nature. There's a distinction in Greek thought between the laws of nature, which are general and universal, and the laws of particular cultures and cities. And if you're a cosmopolitas, a man of the world, so to speak, a citizen of the world, you derive your, you might say, your fundamental identity from the laws of nature. And there you only follow the laws of the country or the city you live in because those are conventional, they're not universal. And by the way, as we will see, that's why he says Moses begins the Torah with creation, to teach you to become a cosmopolitas, to learn the laws of the universal laws of the natural world, which are above the laws of particular cultures and cities, or not above, fundamental. But he's saying there are those who go way above that. And then, in effect, he then goes on to talk about Abraham and talks about how Abraham begins, as a kind of normal sort of person, born, but he becomes a born of heaven person, where he begins to really pursue philosophy and the mind, And that's the reason why he has his name changed, because he becomes a different person. So skip to number 65, because this is where he's getting back to the text. But the sons of earth.
But the sons of earth, removing their minds from contemplation and becoming deserted so as to fly to the lifeless and immovable nature of the flesh, for they too became one flesh, as the lawgiver says, adulterated the excellent coinage, and abandoned the better rank which has been allotted to them as their own, and deserted to the worse rank which was contrary to their original nature.
Stop there. Where is the notion of becoming one flesh? It's when Adam meets Eve, or time the man meets the woman, and they become one flesh. Remember, he sees the woman as the symbol of the fleshy existence, and therefore this is a bad thing in his eyes, which is contrary to, in fact, what the biblical text says. And then he's going to refer, if you go to Genesis chapter 10, this is after the flood, and it's in the section of the nations of the world. If you go to Genesis 10:29, which is on page, he's actually got a different.
Starts at the bottom of 18.
Yeah, he's got a different. They've got a different numbering here. It's just talking about Nimrod. Where is Nimrod? Oh, it's in fact it must be a typo or something. It's verse 8. It's verse 8. It talks about Cush begot Nimrod, who was the first man of might on the earth.
What chapter is that?
This is Genesis chapter 10. This is on page 18 of the Tanakh. He was a mighty hunter by the grace of the Lord, hence the saying, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter by the grace of the Lord. Now again, this is a fragment referring to some kind of epic story about this guy Nimrod, who in the Midrash, by the way, becomes the king of Ur, who is the one who throws Abraham into a fiery furnace for smashing his father's idols. But the point is, Nimrod, it says, is a mighty hunter, literally before the Lord, and he was. But the first verse is he was the first one to be a man of might on earth. So what is now? Look what Philo does with this. Read on. Nimrod.
Let's see. Nimrod being interpreted means desertion. For it was not.
Oh yes, you skipped the part. Go ahead. Nimrod being the first to set the example.
Oh yeah, Nimrod being the first to set the example of this desertion, for the lawgiver says, quote, that this man began to be a giant upon the earth.
Now he's translating the word for Gibor, which is a man of might or even a warrior. No, actually here the first one is a chel. Hey, chel. No, I'm right. Gibor. He's translating Gibor as giant. Go on.
Let me see, where are we?
Means desertion.
Nimrod means desertion, for it was not enough for the thoroughly miserable soul to stand on neither side, but having gone over to its enemies, it took up arms against its friends and resisted them, and made open war upon them. In reference to which fact it is that Moses calls the seat of Nimrod's kingdom Babylon, and the interpretation of the word Babylon is change, a thing nearly akin to desertion. The name too being akin to the name, and the one action to the other, for the first step of every deserter is a change and alteration of the mind. Which is
interesting, because in Hebrew the word Bavel is actually in chapter 11, which is the story of the Tower of Babel, is connected with the Hebrew word Balal, meaning to confound or to not change. He's interpreting Babylon to come from a root meaning changeable, as opposed to the Hebrew play on words of Bavel and Baval, meaning confound, because the people stopped speaking the same language, and they were it said the Lord scattered them over the face of the earth. They stopped building the city. That is why it's called Babel, because the Lord confounded Baval, the speech of the whole earth. Okay, Balal. So he's making a change. Keep going, and it would be consistent.
And it would be consistent in the truth to say that, according to the most holy Moses, the bad man, as being one destitute of a home and of a city, without any settled habitation, and the fugitive is naturally a deserter also, but the good man is the firmest of allies.
All right, we can stop there. So this short treatise is an example, I think, a really good example of his philosophical exegesis. How he takes these texts from the Bible and he turns them into philosophical and moral lessons. And so for him, this is not a story about giants. This is not a story about, for him, it would have been literally impossible for divine beings to have sex with human women. For him, this is an allegory of people who desert the life of the intellect and the spirit and pursue fleshy delights, hedonism, and therefore become of the earth. And you know, that he does that with all kinds of parts of, again, he doesn't necessarily deny, especially when it comes to the laws, their literal meaning, but he's always ready to apply some kind of philosophical or allegorical interpretation to them, which, by the way, is something that's what the Jewish tradition does with the Bible.
That's right.
The rabbis often did this with, and not only to explicate the meaning, but to derive some kind of, the rabbis tended to want to get a moral understanding of the text, rather than what we would call an allegorical meaning of the text. But this is midrash. It's philosophical midrash, but that's what it is. And it was going on as even before there was a Torah, there was interpretation of sacred scripture. In the Torah itself, we find later texts reinterpreting or interpreting earlier texts. It happens all the time in the Tanakh itself. So it goes right back to the composition of the texts themselves, the editing of the texts themselves. So this is a very ancient tradition that we find. And every culture the Jews lived in obviously are going to have an impact on that interpretation. And for Philo, it's the Middle Platonic schools of philosophy that we're dealing with here. Anybody have any last questions about this particular thing? Yes, I have a new one. I haven't given it out yet. Yes.
How did Joseph come to deserve, in a sense, the Ruach Elohim? Was it because of being able to save the Jews? And I also wonder, why is he not included in the patriarchs?
Well, because not all the people of Israel descended from Joseph. In other words, you have Isaac is descended from Abraham, Jacob's, and then you have the tribes.
I thought it might have been because he eventually enslaved the Egyptians.
No.
Under the
No, not at all. The point is that you ask a good question. I don't know the answer to that. Why was Joseph picked to have the Ruach Elohim? I'm not sure, but it certainly denotes that he had something about him. We might call it charisma. That he was attractive, smart, intelligent, at least when he grew up. He was a spoiled brat when he was younger. But the point is, by the time he became, who he was, he had this incredible ability of leadership and ability to, look what, who says he's filled with Ruach Elohim? It's Pharaoh, when he interprets Pharaoh's dreams. So Pharaoh says, this is a man who's filled with the Ruach Elohim, because he interprets the dream. I think in that case, he's in effect saying he's like a prophet, that he has prophetic ability. That's probably where it comes from. Okay, so if we now go from him as again, we're not making a sharp divide here, from him as the Bible interpreter to him as the philosopher, one of the most, and he deals with all kinds of philosophical issues. He deals with issues about virtue and how to live the happy life. In other words, there's a ton of material here, and we're not obviously going to even look at but a fragment of it. But one of the most important and interesting issues is the issue of creation. How was the world created? And here, in Philo's day, there were two schools of thought, essentially, the Aristotelian and the Platonic. In the Aristotelian school, there is no creation. The universe has always existed. It is infinite. And it may change, but only within certain limits, the physical universe. The non-physical universe never really changes. But there's no end to it. There's no beginning. There's no end. It is completely infinite. In the Platonic view, there is a beginning, but the universe emerges out of primordial matter. In other words, there is the basic stuff out of which the universe emerged is infinite. It's always been there, but then an ordered universe emerges out of it. And once having emerged, it then remains. Those are the two general philosophical traditions at the time of Philo. These two ideas, of course, last into the Middle Ages. And what is the problem in the Middle Ages for a Jew about these two ideas?
Neither of them talk about a creator.
Well, they both believe in God, and in the Platonic thing, God is the one that causes the ordering of creation.
Is it the Galilean Copernicus?
No, that's later on. That's later on. In fact, in the Guide of the Perplexed, Maimonides deals with these two, goes into great detail about the Aristotelian and the Platonic versions of creation. The Platonic one is primarily from the Timaeus. That's where most of the medieval philosophers got their ideas of it. But in the common Jewish view, how did the universe start?
God created
Out of
the Word.
nothing.
Out of
Nothing.
And by the Middle Ages, Jews believed that God created what we call ex nihilo, out of nothing. Now, in Philo's day, there was no such idea amongst the Jews. There's been a lot of arguments about this by scholars. When did the idea of creation ex nihilo, out of nothing, first appear? It actually first appears amongst the Christians. I forget when, but it's not in the New Testament.
Not in the Old Testament?
It's not in the Hebrew Bible. It's not in there's one text in the Midrash which seems to maybe be it, but probably is not. There's a text in Second Maccabees that seems to allude to it, but in fact it is not. There's no clear-cut evidence for the idea of creation ex nihilo in Christian,
Ex nihilo?
out of nothing. Something from nothing.
So it first appears in the New Testament?
No, it doesn't appear in the New Testament. It's in the Church Fathers, I think in the 3rd century or something like that. But the point is, it doesn't appear in Judaism until it first appears in Sadia Gaon in the 10th century. By that point, it's already established because he mentions it as a kind of established idea, but that's the first textual reference to it. So Philo's not working with that idea at all. Now, what's the problem with ex nihilo? The Greeks basically had a basic principle of what we would call physics that says nothing comes from nothing. That you cannot have something coming from nothing.
So how can you have a world?
A word is not something.
No, a world.
A world? they said, well, Aristotle said the world was always there. In other words, the world is eternal. I mean, forget our modern science, okay? We know about the Big Bang, but the point is, for the Greeks, something cannot come from nothing. So essentially, that was an accepted idea. But why all of a sudden does it appear in Christian and then in Jewish thought? It's quite simple. It's about resurrection of the dead. That's
well, it's similar. It's a similar, unbelievable idea.
Well, it's like this. It's like this. Remember the physical theory that everything's composed of 4 elements and things change. So when somebody dies, their soul goes to heaven, all right, say, and their body gets recycled and is reused in other creatures, animals, humans, because the matter goes into plants, the plants grow up, people eat it, or creatures, and then they die and it gets recycled and recycled and recycled. Okay, Christians and Jews and Muslims believe at the end of days God will resurrect everybody in their bodies. Well, there's a problem now, right? Because their body, the material of their body, has been reused in other bodies. So if God says, well, I'm going to take all the original material and put it into the original body, what happens to the other people who use that material? This was a problem of what you might call a clash of science and religion. Right? The science of the day said that all these things, all this matter gets recycled. The religious doctrine says you get resurrected in your original body. Well, what's the answer to that question? God creates new matter for the body. The point is that in the Middle Ages, many Jews and Christians and Muslims said that God can create something from nothing in order to resurrect everybody in a body. Rather than, now Sadja actually doesn't like this, and so it's mentioned in a part of his text where he's refuting this idea, by the way, because he has this fascinating explanation how God, in fact, can reuse all of this stuff and still have everybody with it. He doesn't like the idea of new matter, but that's where it comes from. So if God can create new matter from something from nothing, then the original creation had to be something from nothing. And therefore, Jews and Christians went back to the beginning of Genesis and interpreted Genesis 1 to mean that God creates something from nothing. Go take a look at the Tanakh on page 1. It says, in our modern translation, verse 1 says, when God began to create heaven and earth, that is, what do we call that clause in English? A subordinate clause. Now we have a parenthetical description of that original state, which is verse 2. Yeah. The earth being formed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep, and a wind from God sweeping over the water. So in other words, the original state of the world is tohu vavohu, unformed and void. Or as my teacher, the late Yochanan Must, translated as chaos shmeos. Verse 3 is actually the continuation of verse 1. In other words, if you take out verse 2, you end up with a complete sentence. When God began to create heaven and earth, God said, let there be light, and there was light. So that, according to our modern understanding of this, there is a primordial chaos out of which God creates the universe. The Torah doesn't really discuss where that primordial chaos comes from. It's not concerned with that. It doesn't really care. What does it really care about? That order emerges from chaos, that God creates a harmonious order out of chaotic matter. It doesn't really it doesn't get into the philosophical issue of, well, then where did the chaos come from? Later Jews did want to know where the chaos came from. So, what was the old translation? In the beginning, God created, and that translation reflects the notion of creation ex nihilo. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth, meaning there was a beginning, and there was something that came from nothing.
So
then
the
it's
true
never.
literal translation is a process, is when God began to create a process, not
Yes.
in the beginning.
Yes, it doesn't mean in the beginning. But if you look at the way it's later understood,
Yeah.
it is translated as in the beginning.
And then is that the earth being unformed and void, not
Meaning that's the beginning, that's the first stuff that was
that
created.
God created?
Right.
Yeah.
God creates the primordial matter, and then
Right.
out of that matter,
Human.
in other words, the potter makes the clay, and then out of the clay comes the pot. So
Fascinating.
that's what Jews in the Middle Ages believed, and it became a doctrine of Judaism. Maimonides deals with the Aristotelian idea, the Platonic idea of creation out of primordial matter, and the biblical one. And of course, as being a good Jew, he has to accept the biblical one, but he admits the fact that the most logical one to accept is the Platonic. He really criticizes the Aristotelian one and rejects it, but he in effect says if the Torah didn't say this, we would have to accept the Platonic one. Now, so when we're looking at Philo's understanding of creation, we have to understand that this is not an issue for him. For him, being a Platonist, there is this primordial matter that has always existed, and the universe emerged out of it, and that's it. What he's really interested in is that process, which of course Platonism goes into in great detail. Okay?
Does Sajid Gaon also feel that way? Do you know?
No, Sajid Gaon being our first great medieval philosopher living in an Arab country, writing in Arabic, he is, by his day, it is already an accepted doctrine that God created something from nothing. We don't know exactly when it started in the Jewish tradition. It's before Sa'adja, but we have no idea. Sometime between the end of the writing of the Talmud and Sa'adja Gaon, which is a couple hundred year period, this became a doctrine of Jewish belief.
Say again where Maimonides?
He had to accept something from nothing. He, in the Guide for the Perplexed, he has a whole section on creation where he goes through the different theories. He talks about what Aristotle thought, he talks about what Plato thought, and then he talks about the biblical notion, which in his day is something from nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that he has to accept, otherwise he would have been considered a heretic.
But God created that something from nothing.
But that's a later idea. In the Bible, it doesn't exist. There is nowhere in the Bible that suggests that God creates something from nothing.
Even astronomers and scientists today believe something like that when they say it all started with a big bang.
Except the prevalent theory now amongst most cosmologists is that the Big Bang was not a singular event, but was part of an ongoing, infinite bubbling up of multiple universes. So the scientists are still arguing the Platonic or Aristotelian stuff versus a biblical-like account. If you believe that this is the only universe there is, then the Big Bang, to some extent, is something from nothing, but the word nothing is a very complex idea. There was a guy who wrote a whole book about nothing in the last few years, okay? What does it mean? What is nothing? Well, no thing, no form. Even cosmologists who believe there's only one universe say that what was before the Big Bang was a quantum field of potential particles bursting into existence and dying out, and that one of them burst into existence and then burst in the universe. So when you say there was nothing, you're kicking things back and saying, well, what does nothing mean? I mean, even when you look at the Kabbalists, for example, they deal with this issue in great, great detail. And for them, what is the nothing? It is, in fact, it is God. That there is God, and God in a certain sense, for those of you who remember studying Kabbalah with me, what is first there? The Ein Sof, which means the infinite. And out of the infinite emerges, through a series of layered emergences, the spirit eventually gets to the point where it produces matter. For them, it's a very complex process, because how out of a purely spiritual being comes a material universe? In effect, that's what the Platonic version is all about. How do you get a spiritual being producing a material universe? Well, there's this material that pre-exists, but by the Middle Ages, Jews couldn't believe that. And neither did Christians or Muslims.
But the Aristotelians believe that the universe as it is always has been.
Yes, it's a.
So there's no creating.
There's no creation in the Aristotelian universe. There's no creation. And by the way, the prevalent scientific theory at the beginning of the 20th century, before the discovery of the expanding universe, was essentially an Aristotelian universe. It was called the steady state theory, that stars were burning out, but then new ones were formed, and that there was no beginning to the universe and no end to the universe, and things just keep going on, and new matter is, because matter is never fully destroyed. But then Edwin Hubble discovered the fact that galaxies are retreating from one another, moving apart, and out of that emerged the theory of the Big Bang, which was proven by Penzias, and I forget who else the other one was, who discovered the echo of the Big Bang, accidentally, by the way, working at Bell Labs in New Jersey, and for which they won a Nobel Prize. And since then, the notion that at least this universe came out of some kind of explosive initial beginning is the prevalent theory. And they have mapped that now. They have pictures of the cosmos to within less than 1 million years before the Big Bang. You can see it through various kinds of background, what they call the background radiation.
The explosions are still going on. The expansions.
It's not an explosion in the normal sense of the word, but the universe is expanding. The weird thing that they have discovered in the last 10, 15 years is that the expansion rate is accelerating, which didn't make a hell of a lot of sense. But now there's all kinds of arguments about why this is happening and everything.
But if you get a start, there has to be an end.
No, there doesn't have to be. Well, a star can have an end, but then the matter of a star goes supernova and blows up, and then the matter that flings out there is then assembled into new stars or planets, which is exactly how our planet came into existence.
I didn't say star.
He said
I said start.
But one could say there is no such thing as a start the way we understand the word start. That we could say that on some level it's an infinite process. In other words, if the Big Bang emerged out of a previous universe, then it's like Aristotle, but it's a kind of combination of Aristotle and Plato.
Where did the other universe come from?
Right.
A previous universe. In other words, it's an infinite process. It's an infinite process. And some universes have, and each universe has in effect its own laws of physics. They don't have to be the same ones in every universe. Our particular universe produced a series of physical laws and constraints that allowed the emergence of our conscious life, ultimately. But that doesn't mean the universe could have had to be that way.
Is that the thinking?
Yeah.
That there could be other setups, so to speak?
Well, if you have an infinite number of universes, one of them at least is going to produce conscious life.
Right, but you're saying that the laws of physics would be different.
They don't have to be the same in each one.
They just say that. I mean, who knows?
This universe is a very particular universe with certain kinds of laws, but also certain kinds of cosmological constraints in the way it is structured from the atomic level up. And if one of those constraints were slightly different, we would not be here. So scientists are very bothered by this because it looks like the universe was designed for human life or conscious life. So one of the reasons why they've come up with the multi-universe, in effect, is to...
Because they don't like that.
They don't like that. And you know what? There are those physicists who will say, we've actually proven the multi-universe. There's others who say, no, you haven't. So this is one of the big arguments that's going on in modern cosmology. Is there a multi-universe or a multiverse? In other words, they say, is our universe just a small part of a larger, infinite variety of universes? Or is this a particular universe, and is this the only one there is? If it is, then it is a very, very particular universe.
Where do you get most of your reading from to keep you up to date on?
I would be happy to supply you with a list. There's been wonderful. First of all, I read the Science Times every week on Tuesdays, and I get a weekly science magazine called Science News, and I keep up sometimes. I read. There's online articles, and also certain books that have come out in the last. I started reading about this more than 30 years ago. And I've kept up with the cosmology as it's gone along because I find the whole thing fascinating. I've even written about it, too. I've written several articles about it. If you're interested, I can give it to you. I mean, the problem with writing an article about cosmology is 5 years later it's out of date. Okay. Do you mind if we go for a little bit longer? What I've given you is what we're covering next, which is his idea of creation. And one of the things that we first need to discuss, and if you took my course in the New Testament, we talked a little bit about this, is the concept of what's called the Logos, which is very, very well developed in Philo. The idea that there is an intermediary, a divine celestial intermediary between God and the universe, and in fact, the Logos is God's creative agent that produces the universe. You'll see why I gave you that passage in Greek, but the highlighted words are mostly the word logos or logos, depending upon the declension, and the word nomon, which is nomos, which means law. So what we're going to look at is we're going to look at how did this idea develop in the ancient world, and it emerges out of certain biblical texts, such as Proverbs. It's not only existent in Greek, but in Aramaic translations of the Bible, where logos is translated as memar. And we'll see how Philo deals with it. And then we're going to just jump into his treatise on creation. We're not going to look at the whole thing, but we're going to look at parts of it to give you an idea of how he believes the universe came into being, which is essentially a middle Platonic idea, but he connects it up to the Bible, to the Torah. And for him, it is one of the most important concepts, the notion of creation. And most Jewish philosophy deals with creation is a central issue in Jewish philosophy, but it starts with Philo. Sa'adja deals with it extensively. Maimonides deals with it extensively. In other words, any Jewish philosopher from Philo on deals with how did the universe come into being? How did God, what was the process of creation? So that's where we'll end up next week.